Hello, and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Today I want to talk about Bill C-238. Now, this is an anti-gun smuggling bill that was recently defeated in Parliament. The vote was largely along party lines, with the Conservatives voting for it and the Liberals and NDP voting against it. This is a private member's bill. They rarely become law. However, this one's gotten a fair bit of commentary online with people saying, see, the Liberals and the NDP don't care about gun smuggling. They just want to go after law-abiding gun owners. And, I mean, certainly the recent gun ban was squarely aimed at people who lawfully owned a collection of firearms. And it was very poorly thought out. It's going to have a lot of impact on law-abiding gun owners. However, if people think I'm a partisan hack, hopefully this video will disabuse them, because I don't like this bill. I think it's a good thing that it was defeated, and I'm going to go through the bill and sort of explain what it does, and then talk a little bit about why I don't like it, where I think the problems are. So let's first dive in and have a look at, let's start with section 96. And the reason why I'm starting with the criminal code is so we can look at the section that gets changed, and then we can see how it changes and what it does. So section 96 is possession of weapon obtained by commission of an offense. Also often described as, possession of a weapon obtained by crime. So subject to subsection 3, and that's an exception that doesn't come up all that often for this section, but it's basically the inheritance section. Every person commits an offense who possesses a firearm, a prohibited weapon, restricted weapon, prohibited device, or any prohibited ammunition that the person knows was obtained by the commission in Canada of an offense or by an act or omission anywhere that, if it had occurred in Canada, would have constituted an offense. And every person commits an offense under subsection 1 is guilty of either an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment of a term not exceeding 10 years and to a minimum punishment of imprisonment for a term of 1 year, or, if the Crown proceeds summarily, is guilty of an offense punishable on summary conviction. I think that I haven't looked up whether this has been challenged, but this sort of split minimum issue where if the Crown proceeds by indictment, there's a minimum, otherwise there's no minimum, is probably vulnerable to a constitutional attack. This was one of the issues that came up in the case of the Queen and Nur. So that's sort of our starting point here, as we've got a maximum penalty if the Crown proceeds by indictment of 10 years, and that would, have a minimum punishment of 1 year. Now let's go and look at Bill C-238. It proposes to add a couple of things. The first thing is this bit here, which essentially adds to the bail section, and this is a section that describes what are called reverse onus offenses. Now, reverse onus offenses are situations where instead of the Crown having to prove that, or having to show that you should be denied bail when you go for a bail hearing, you instead have to show that you should be granted bail. So it inverts the standard rules. So this would add this particular sort of issue to the sections where you have to show that you should be granted bail. Now, what sort of issue are we talking about here? We are talking about adding to this every person who commits an offense under subsection 1. So that's the possession of, any of these items that was obtained by commission of an offense. When the object in question was obtained by the commission of an offense under subsection 103 sub 1 is, if prosecuted by indictment, liable to the imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years and to a minimum punishment of imprisonment for a term of A, in the case of a first offense, 3 years, and B, in the case of a second or subsequent offense, 5 years. So they'd still be able to proceed, because it says if, they'd still be able to proceed summarily, but if the Crown proceeds by indictment, then there's a mandatory penalty of 3 years or 5 years if it's not their first go, and a 14-year maximum. So you remember what I was saying earlier about the constitutional issue with respect to that sort of split sentence where you've got the summary conviction and then the indictable. Well, that sort of split sentence is much worse in this particular section. The other thing to consider here is look at the impact on somebody who's been charged, because if they're saying, hey, listen, what happens sometimes is they might say, if you plead guilty, we'll let you plead guilty to the summary conviction, we'll re-elect down to summary conviction. But if you go to trial, we're going to proceed by indictment, which means, you're either risking a 3-year mandatory minimum or you plead guilty. That's always a problem, because if you're an innocent person, that deal still looks pretty hard to turn down, because staring at a 3-year mandatory minimum is, a lot of people are going to blink when that's what they're facing. So in my view, that's a bit of a problem here already. I also find it not too difficult to envision circumstances where the 3-year mandatory minimum here would offend constitutional principles. In particular, we get some weird issues, but let's sort of stop here. I'm going to go and look at section 103 because we should know what that means. So this is basically a sentence enhancement to possession of a firearm obtained by crime. Let's look at what enhances the sentence. So importing or exporting knowing it is unauthorized. Every person commits an offense who imports or exports a prohibited firearm, restricted firearm, non-restricted firearm, prohibited weapon, restricted weapon, a prohibited device, or any prohibited ammunition, or any component or part designed exclusively for use in the manufacture of or assembly into an automatic firearm, knowing that the person is not authorized to do so under the Firearms Act or any other act of Parliament, or any regulations made under an act of Parliament. And let's look at the penalty for this. So punishment, if it's a firearm or prohibited device or prohibited ammunition, which is what we're talking about for section 96. Guilty of an indictable offense, so straight indictable, no summary conviction option here, and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 10 years, and to a minimum punishment of imprisonment for a term of, in the case of a first offense, 3 years, or in the case of a second or subsequent offense, 5 years. So right away, we see that the penalty that you can get for simply possessing a firearm obtained by crime that was at some point imported in the past is 14 years as a maximum, and here for actually importing it, it's 10 years. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Why is it more, why are we going after the person downstream more than the person who's actually importing it? That seems to me to be a bit of an issue. We're also going to have a proof issue. And the reason why I say that is if we look at section 96 again, the sentence enhancement here, or we'll look at it in the context of the Private Members Bill, applies when the object in question was obtained by the commission of an offense under subsection 103. So if the Crown wants to use this to enhance the sentence, they have to prove two things, or two offenses. The first thing they have to prove is the offense of possession of the property that was obtained by crime, but then they also have to prove the import-export, the section 103 charge. And if we look at that, it's a fairly difficult thing here, because this is one that requires knowing that the person is not authorized to do so under the Firearms Act or any other act of Parliament. What this will mean is you'll end up with these trials where they have to prove two things against two different people, because the guy who has the firearm probably isn't the guy who was the importer. But you also have to prove that the importer committed that offense, so you have to essentially have a trial against the importer at the same time as you're having a trial against the guy who was found with the gun. That's going to be a very difficult scenario for proof. I suspect that a lot of the time the Crown isn't going to proceed with that just because of how difficult and how much of a headache that would be. So that's another big problem with this one. It's also very strange when you think about it to have this sentence enhancement specifically for smuggling. And the reason why I say that is that in my experience, laws tend to be very bad at actually stopping crime. The people who have illegal firearms are doing so typically because they are engaged in the practice of drug dealing, which is a dangerous practice. They're acquiring these firearms to protect themselves because they're afraid of other people in the drug dealing sphere. So saying, listen, you can't have a gun, they're going to anyway. They don't really care about the laws. and adding a little bit of extra punishment to that isn't likely to affect it. However, what we can do sometimes is we can push crimes around. So we can get people to commit one crime instead of another crime. If we look at our incentives here, we've actually got a bit of a weird incentive, because we're saying it's extra punishable if this was smuggled from out of the country, but not if you obtained it illegally within Canada. So, for instance, if you stole this from a police officer, that's not smuggling. So, no extra punishment on that. If you stole it from, a gun owner, again, not smuggled, so you don't have that extra sentence enhancement. If you manufactured it illegally here, and, again, not smuggling. So this creates a very weird kind of buy local principle. And I'm all for buy local normally. I like the idea of, supporting your local community. But maybe not crime local. Maybe not commit offenses against Canadians instead of smuggling. I don't, I think that that's a weird encouragement. I don't know if it'll actually change things, if, criminals would adapt their behavior to steal more guns locally rather than smuggling them. But if it's going to do anything, that's what it's going to do. And I have a problem with that as well. We can see some situations where this mandatory minimum might cause problems. Let's say you've got, Joe and Frank, and Joe is, normally a stand-up sort of guy, but his brother Frank is getting into some bad stuff. And Joe at some point, he's over at Frank's house and he finds out that Frank's got an illegal firearm. And he doesn't want to call the cops on his brother, and doesn't want to, get him into trouble, but he also is kind of concerned with what he's going to do with this gun. So he takes the gun and hides it so that his brother can't find it. And, in doing so, he'd be committing an offense. He's now in possession of a firearm that was obtained by commission of an offense, to wit, stealing the gun from Frank. And let's assume that Frank got this gun by buying it from a drug smuggler. Well, now, we're talking about the situation where he's got this illegal firearm but didn't intend to do anything with it. Is 3 years an appropriate sentence for that? I think maybe not. Let's talk about somebody, if you have a collector who buys a illegal firearm and then immediately deactivates it because, he just wants a thing to put on his wall. Again, illegal while he was in possession of that illegal firearm and the buying of it and so forth. But in terms of the, possession of the firearm obtained by crime, I don't know if 3 years is an appropriate penalty for somebody whose goal in that sense was just to deactivate it. These are just sort of some things that I think of off the top of my head. So I think that those are, I think that this bill is designed in a way where it doesn't necessarily accomplish what it was meant to. I think that the heart is in the right place. They're saying, listen, we want to go after smugglers and we want to, cut off and dry up that particular flow of firearms into the country. I just don't think this is the way to accomplish it. And I think that the penalties aspect is likely to raise constitutional issues. It would certainly be challenged as to whether this sentence was one that offended the charter. I suspect that this is also an area where what we need probably isn't bigger penalties, but instead more enforcement and more detection. The penalties for importing a firearm are already pretty high. I don't think there's a whole lot of people who would say, oh, good, I'm just going to be looking at 3 years or 1 year or whatever. The problem is that our detection is not great. So there's probably a lot of people committing this offense without necessarily being caught for it. And we tend to deter crime more effectively by catching more people and making it something where you're more certain to get caught than we do by imposing sort of strict penalties. Because if you're only, if you're unlikely to actually get punished for it, the fact that the punishment is really severe isn't going to weigh nearly as much. You can actually have much lighter penalties so long as your chance of detection is higher. If we think about this in an extreme fashion, if your chance of being caught was 100%, the punishment doesn't have to be that much before you say, well, that's not worth it. That's a bad idea. But if your chance of being caught is 1%, the punishment can be really severe, and it still might be, a gamble that people are willing to take. The other thing is this assumption that people are really looking at this rationally is often one that isn't supported. Most criminals aren't making rational decisions. So, again, detection works better there because you can find the people when they're doing it. But people tend to assume, oh, I'm not going to get caught until they get caught. So anyway, that's sort of my thoughts on this one. Please let me know in the comments. This is a bit of a controversial position within the firearm community. I know there's some people who are really upset that this bill didn't pass. Maybe you think I'm out to lunch. It wouldn't be the first time that I've had an opinion that was not a good one. But let me know what you think. Please like this video. Please share it with your friends. Subscribe if you want to see more content. I also want to thank my Patreon supporters at the $50 level: D. Moe, Sir Daniel Wicks of Alberta, Canada's National Firearms Association, and Kyle Martin. And at the $20 level, Cameron Johnson, Kevin Fleet, Dale Nesbitt, and Andrew Elsich, as well as many of you at the $10 level who will be in the crawl immediately following. Thank you for watching, and I hope this has armed you with knowledge.